Addressing the princes, chiefs, and people of India in a famous proclamation issued in November 1858, announcing the transfer of administrative authority over Indian territories from the English East India Company to the British Crown following the 1857 rebellion, Queen Victoria assured her new subjects in the subcontinent that she was bound to them by the same obligations of duty which bound her to all her other subjects around the world. Further, she expressed her earnest desire to stimulate the peaceful industry of India, to promote works of public utility and improvement, and to administer India's government for the benefit of all subjects resident therein. In 1908, Victoria's son and successor Edward VII issued another royal proclamation addressing the people of India to mark the 50th anniversary of his mother's promise of prosperity and social advancement to her Indian subjects. The King Emperor believed that in the intervening half-century of British rule, the noble assurances of his mother had not been forgotten and ignored. He told the Indian people, "The schemes that have been diligently framed and executed for promoting your material convenience and advance, schemes unsurpassed in their magnitude and boldness, bear witness before the world to the zeal with which Queen Victoria's benignant promise has been fulfilled." Now, to be fair to the great King Emperor, let's not dismiss his assertion out of hand, even though it sounds shamelessly self-congratulatory. I mean, he's not totally talking out of his royal bottom. According to one optimistic but respectable estimate compiled by a British official, India's national income increased by a little more than 50% between 1875 and 1895, from 574 crore rupees to 876 crore rupees, a growth rate of around 2.5% a year. Okay, not very impressive, but it implies some growth, right? But you know what was impressive? The extraordinary expansion of public works, as Queen Victoria promised, or what we today call infrastructure development. Roads, ports, telegraph lines, and most importantly, railways and canals. India went from having about 1,000 kilometers of open railway tracks in 1860 to more than 50,000 kilometers in 1910, and Indian Railways had the distinction of being the fourth largest railway system in the world by then. Similarly, by the 1890s, more than 70,000 kilometers of canals and distributaries had been laid out, irrigating more than 5 million hectares of cultivated land, covering roughly 6.5% of total area under cultivation. The expansion of railways, the introduction of the steamship, and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 ensured that India played an important role in the unprecedented increase of international trade that occurred in the second half of the 19th century, the first era of globalization driven by the ideology of free trade originating in Britain. India's imports and exports both boomed. Between 1859-60 and 1909-10, the value of Indian exports increased by 2.7 times in real terms, and the value of imports into India during the same period increased by 2.1 times also in real terms. The ratio of the value of India's total foreign trade, imports and exports put together, and the national income doubled from 10% to 20% between 1860 and 1914, a clear illustration of the increasing importance of foreign trade to the economic activities of India's people. By the first decade of the 20th century, Indian exports constituted around 4% of total world exports according to trade statistics published by the United Nations, which was obviously much lesser than the leading capitalist countries of the world at the time like the United Kingdom, USA, Germany, etc., but was still surprisingly greater than the share of global exports of other more developed countries like Italy, Japan, Australia, or comparable countries like Brazil. The fact that even in 2019, India's share of global merchandise exports stood at 1.7% indicates just how deeply India was integrated into international trade networks during the first era of globalization. As one British official boasted at the close of the 19th century, it was possible for the smallest Indian cultivator to sell his produce direct to the agent of a European firm at the price current in the world market, an achievement British policy planners and administrators acting in accordance with the principles of free trade could definitely be proud of. The second half of the 19th century also saw the birth and growth of modern mechanized industry in India, the most important of which was the cotton textile industry centered largely in Bombay and to a lesser extent in Ahmedabad. The first Indian-owned cotton mill was established in Bombay in 1854 by a Parsi businessman by the name of C.N. Dawar. By 1914, there were 271 textile mills across the country, spinning nearly 300,000 tons of yarn and weaving more than 1,100 million yards of cloth and providing on average employment to more than 250,000 people daily. Run on imported machinery aided by substantial numbers of European technical and supervisory staff, Indian-owned factory-made textile products not only competed with British textile imports and domestic handicraft products for market share within India, but also shipped significant quantities of textiles, mostly cotton yarn, to other countries as well. At the peak of the export trade in Indian factory textiles between 1900 and 1910, Bombay cotton mills exported around 65% of their total yarn production abroad, 90% 90% of which went to the biggest market in China. Such was the drastic growth of this modern industry that by the time the King Emperor was delivering his favorable evaluation on half a century of direct British rule in India, it was one of the largest textile producers in Asia in terms of output and a significant player in the global market. Another rousing example of material advancement of India under the benign guidance of the British Crown. Of course, the influence of colonial government and globalization was not restricted to the economic sphere. All sorts of changes were underway at the social level. Certain classes of people that were previously dominant withered away. Other dominant classes managed to retain some semblance of power by allying with the British rulers, although in a subordinate position, while still others leveraged their social position to accumulate economic resources through the market. And then there was the rise of a new class, that quintessential marker of modern society, the middle class, which developed gradually through the second half of the 19th century, finally coming into its own in the 20th century when members from its ranks led the intellectual and political project of national liberation. Lawyers, teachers, doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, managers, bankers, government servants, journalists, artists, public intellectuals, all these people, mostly men who received modern English education, went about trying to reform and modernize Indian society, while simultaneously they demanded concessions from the British government and ultimately challenged the right to rule of the very power that had brought the entire class into existence. Such was the benevolence of the British Empire that in trying to bring material progress and modernity to India, it was willing to disregard the possibility of laying the seeds of its own destruction. I'm not sure if Edward VII had these particular facts and data in mind when he declared the fulfillment of his mother's noble assurances in the proclamation of 1908. But I think they do give a flavor of the kind of facts any number of imperial apologists of the day used to paint a rosy picture of the British administration in India and, like Edward VII, pat themselves on the back for a job well done. Of course, there are a lot of unpleasant facts that are omitted from this picture of a progressive march forwards, like the fact that, yes, total national income grew by around 50% between 1875 and 1895. But if we take into account the country's population and look at national income per capita and then adjust it for inflation, the same optimistic data shows almost perfect stagnation, and that too at an extremely low level of per capita income. The extent of stagnation obviously worsens if we deduct from the national income the money transferred outside India as profits, interest, savings, etc. of British companies, financial firms and individuals operating in India respectively. Various estimates of real wages, that is inflation adjusted wages, in fact show a decline, suggesting that the poorest strata of society, the people who had nothing to sell except their labor, was seeing its daily earnings steadily erode over the same period in which India was in some ways at least growing more prosperous. Look, we have trains now, okay? That's progress, right? I don't know, honestly. Turns out British India was a pretty weird place where you could have quite impressive physical infrastructure and booming foreign trade and modern industry, all that good stuff, coexist with not just falling real wages but also falling life expectancy. Male life expectancy at birth for the decade 1871 to 81 stood at the very low figure of 23.6 years. By the decade of 1911 to 21, it was down to 19.4 years. Life expectancy of females during the same period fell from 25.5 years to 20.9 years. In both instances, the fall is around 17 to 18%. And it's not really a big surprise life expectancy went down if we take into consideration another extremely damning fact about prosperous India, that in the time between the two royal proclamations between 1858 and 1908, around 16 million people perished in famine after famine all over India. This 16 million figure, by the way, is closer to the conservative estimate. Others put the death toll from famines in this period upwards of 30 million. We can quibble about the death toll, but I don't think it would serve any purpose. It should suffice to say that an intolerable number of people perished. The question is, why did they perish? The next section of the video will be devoted to trying to answer that question. But before we get on with that, I want to make one point trying to justify this very lengthy introduction, which I think will be important to keep in mind as we move forward. My main purpose here was to give a taste of the uneven development of India under British rule and to question the perception that I had, and I think a lot of people have, of the colonial period being an era of universal immiserization in India. There were people, not just British but Indian people, who actually did gain materially in varying degrees from the incredible increase in national and international trade, from the large influx of foreign capital, from the substantial build-up of physical infrastructure, from the establishment of an export-oriented, globally significant modern textile industry, and from the growth of the colonial state machinery. There was indeed a prosperous India. It was just, relatively speaking, very small. And as we'll see, the very same institutions, practices, and infrastructure that brought capital, markets, and the ideal of modernity to our shores in the second half of the 19th century made it so that tens of millions of people regularly regularly found themselves in a situation where they did not have enough money to buy food to keep themselves and their families alive. Of course, Edward VII would wholeheartedly disagree with the statement that millions of his subjects died because they were too poor to purchase food. Rather, the British government sought to explain away the famines as natural disasters, as purely the result of a failure of rains. And since no government on earth can control the skies, to expect it to prevent the occurrence of famine was absurd and impractical, like asking the government to wrest the keys of the universe from the hands of the Almighty, as Lord Curzon, Viceroy of India, remarked. One has to commend the Lord Viceroy for his dramatic turn of phrase, but we must acknowledge that his reasoning is more reminiscent of a toddler who cannot look beyond the first degree of causality. Of course, in an extremely broad sense, the famines were natural disasters. An abnormal deficiency in rainfall in a region led to the failure of a portion of food crops, which in turn led to a shortage of food grains. But certain obvious questions can be immediately raised about the adequacy of this simplistic explanation, like, weren't the railways supposed to prevent exactly this kind of a situation? Even in its worst years, the monsoon did not fail all over India at the same time and to the same extent. And so could the grain deficient areas not be spared the worst effects of bad weather by bringing in food grains via railways from regions where rainfall and hence output was normal? In an age where there existed a global market for agricultural commodities, could food grains also not be imported from other countries to make up for the shortfall in output? And the failure of the monsoon was not a new development that only revealed itself to the Indian populace during this period. Rains have been failing in India as elsewhere for thousands of years. And in the pre-globalization age, the surplus from a bumper crop in one year was typically stored locally as insurance against drought in the future. So the question also arises, what happened to this insurance policy? Were the stocks not enough to cover for the loss of output, or were they wiped out altogether? The meteorological explanation of famines offered by British administrators is also inadequate in explaining the terrifying vulnerability of the agricultural classes to drought during a period of booming exports and expanding trade. After all, with the exception of tea, which was grown on British-owned plantations, all other important agricultural exports from the second half of the 19th century onwards, cotton, rice, wheat, jute, opium, groundnut, etc., were produced by peasant households. Where then were the gains from their sale in national and international markets? The answer to this question is not immediately obvious because, if we're talking about the plantation economies of the Caribbean and the American South, or the hacienda or feudal landed estate system of colonial Latin America, then yes, it's easy to understand why the gains from international trade were not passed on to the actual cultivators, because in these places production was controlled by a tiny landed aristocracy who could directly appropriate the labor of their slaves, serfs, or bonded laborers. In contrast, Indian peasants were paying rents and taxes in cash out of their earnings from the sale of agricultural produce in local markets, and though not completely independent, were at least theoretically in much greater control of what to produce and how than the subordinate population in the so-called New World. In fact, while designing the various land revenue systems of India, the British had hoped, or at least claimed to hope, that providing security of land tenure as long as the government's tax demands were met would incentivize landlords and entrepreneurial peasants to utilize the profits from the growth in trade as investments to improve their lands and increase its productivity, similar to how Britain had transitioned into capitalist agriculture. As things turned out, though, this whole plan was a complete failure. No matter which land revenue system the British experimented with, and they experimented with a lot, Indian agriculture did not witness any sustained, widespread trend of productive investment, despite the export boom. Rather, a large number of people who worked the land were in such a precarious position that they were one period of deficient rainfall away from starvation. Drought, thus, was not the first and final cause of famine. It was an immediate cause, the last nudge that pushed peasants and agricultural laborers over the edge, so to speak, into the abyss of starvation and death. If we are to understand the actual cause of famines, then, we have to look for the causes that kept them on the edge, that maintained their precarity not in drought years, but in years when there was no loss of output due to insufficient rains. Once we start looking, we find no dearth of such poverty-inducing causes, all of which, had their roots in the institutions of the colonial state and the increasingly globalized market, such that state and market coercion combined with pre-existing social inequalities to siphon away a large portion of the earnings of the agricultural classes. Underpinning these new forms of appropriation was the British land revenue system, which, despite the myriad forms it took in different parts of the country, had the following things in common. First, the value of land tax was way out of proportion of the ability of peasants to pay it without fail every single year. Second, it was payable in cash and not in kind. And third, non-payment of taxes on time by the cultivator could lead to a potential loss of ownership or occupancy rights to land. As one can imagine, this was a pretty rough deal for the peasants, not just because the state was directly appropriating a chunk of their meager, fluctuating earnings on threat of eviction. No, it gets worse because the process of appropriation itself spawned an entire ecosystem of local players who swarmed in to profit from the misery of the agricultural classes. Unsurprisingly, these were men from the upper end of local social hierarchies who performed a variety of overlapping roles. In places where the state did not extract the tax from the peasant directly, one or several layers of intermediaries existed whose responsibility it was to collect taxes from the cultivators and transfer it to the government, of course taking a cut for themselves for their trouble. Based on the type of revenue system in place, these intermediary guys were known by several names: Zamindars, Talukdars, Mirasdars, Patidars, etc. And they had different powers and functions and came from different social bases, but what they had in common was they all had a claim on the peasant's earnings. Or to put it another way, in addition to bearing the heavy load of taxation, the peasant was also supporting a class of tax intermediaries with their and their families' labor. This fixed, heavy, disproportionate tax burden on the peasant meant that one season of slightly less rainfall, or an episode of extremely low harvest prices, or a sudden expense like an illness or a death was enough to force all but the most substantial landholders into the clutches of the moneylender, another character in the cast of local parasites. And once they were stuck, their chances of escaping the moneylender's debt trap were extremely slim. Pretty soon, with exorbitant rates of interest, a function of the desperation of peasants and the moneylender's social power over them, the amount of outstanding debt inevitably grew several times larger than the original loan. One typical illustration of this trend was uncovered during the investigations of the Deccan Riots Commission and was cited by a British official in 1878. A riot had borrowed 10 rupees, and at the end of 10 years from the date of the loan, his account with his creditors stood thus. He had paid 110 rupees and still owed 220 rupees, so that in the short space of 10 years, through the process of repeated renewal of bonds in which compound interest at high rates was added to the principal, his debt had been made to mount up to 33 times the sum actually borrowed by him. The titular Deccan riots were a series of incidents of violence and arson instigated by peasants against moneylenders and their properties in the Poona and Ahmednagar districts of the Bombay Presidency in 1875, and were one of the relatively milder expressions of peasant outrage against moneylender exploitation in 19th century India. In many of these incidents of rural insurgency, moneylenders' books and accounts were specifically burned, as these were the instruments through which peasants were steadily dispossessed of their assets, first their tools, then their cattle, and ultimately their land, and all for servicing their ever-spiraling debt. The creditor-debtor relationship, writes economist Ameya Kumar Bagchi, was easily transformed into one in which the debtor delivered up whatever surplus produce he had to the creditor. The creditor became his landlord and de facto the master of his whole family. The theoretically free Indian peasant was thus not really free at all to sell his produce to the highest bidder in an open market and take advantage of burgeoning international trade, a rise in prices, and the penetration of railways. Rather, they were more likely to dispose of a portion of their crop as a distress sale to the moneylender to settle a part of their debt, just so they could borrow again to get them through the lean post-harvest months. Not only was there no opportunity to accumulate any kind of surplus that could be the basis for agricultural investment, but peasants were instead reduced to the status of bonded slaves by the functioning of the land revenue system and the rapacity of the zamindars, moneylenders, and traders. J.R. Reid, a British revenue official, described the condition of the peasantry of Azamgarh in present-day Uttar Pradesh in 1870 as follows: "As a rule, they live from hand to mouth and probably always will do so." This was kind of the opposite of what the British had set out to do when guided by the ideas of Ricardo, Malthus, and Mill. They were going about the country conducting sociological experiments for the purpose of obtaining land revenue. The Famine Commission of 1901 brought to notice the huge gap between the stated intentions of the framers of the revenue system of Bombay Presidency and the reality of its functioning. They expected the accumulation of agricultural capital, but their plans did not promote thrift, nor did they conduce to the independence of the ryot. They looked for the capitalist cultivator and we find the Saukars serf. The commission, though, was at pains to declare that this disparity in intention and outcome was not due to any lack of care for the well-being of the people. I'm not sure if we can absolve the makers of India's land revenue systems to that degree, but let's agree with that for a second. The truth is, no matter how benevolent the British administrators were or how brilliant their theoretical formulations regarding land rent, their noble intentions were always subordinated to the pragmatic concern of providing profits to British industrial capitalists and financiers. Being the single largest source of British revenue, there could be no let up in the land revenue demands of the government, as the revenue collected had to first and foremost cover the cost of securing and running the empire, create what we would today call a stable business environment. Thus, in the 1860s and 70s, a little more than 60% of government expenditure was dedicated to this end. Around 30% of the expenditure went towards maintaining and stocking the military, while around 30% was spent on the administrative machinery of the colonial state, the latter including the handsome salaries, pensions, and allowances paid to British officials in India and abroad. And once the Indian peasantry had been made to pay in large part for its own military subjugation and exploitation, whatever was left in the treasury was obviously spent on health and education for the benefit of the population. I'm kidding, of course. The expenditure on public health and education was minuscule relative to the expenditure on military and administration, both hovering between 2 to 4% towards the end of the 19th century, which would explain the extremely low literacy rate of 6.2% in 1901 and the dismal trend in falling life expectancy at birth mentioned in the introduction. No, once a stable business environment had been created, a bulk of the remaining revenue was largely given away to British business interests. The biggest beneficiaries of what amounted to massive state subsidies were private railway companies. Although undertaken by private companies, elements of risk and competition were mostly absent from their operations. The earliest railway companies were more like regional monopolies who were given land for free by the British government and were assured a guaranteed return of 5% on their investment. That is, if the companies were unable to earn enough profit through their operations to provide a 5% return to their shareholders, the government would make up for the shortfall out of its revenues. The guarantee system, as it was called, was an outstanding example of private enterprise at public risk. The costs were borne by the Indian taxpayer, among the poorest in the world, who subsidized the working of unprofitable lines, while the profits, guaranteed by the government, went to eager investors of railway companies in Britain and railway suppliers, who, thanks to the Buy British policy of the companies, were also from Britain, a huge missed opportunity for the development of modern heavy industry in India. As Irfan Habib points out, except for ballast for the railway tracks and coal, everything needed for the railways, down to sleepers, had to come from Britain, not to speak of locomotives, wagons, and passenger carriages. The total British monopoly over Indian railways ensured that all the direct stimulating effects of railway construction in India would be received by British industry alone. The terms of the guarantee system were also not conducive to economic efficiency, since returns on capital invested were guaranteed and the expenditure of the companies not monitored closely by the government. It in fact incentivized wasteful spending, leading one British official to characterize Indian railways as the most extravagant works ever undertaken. The scale of the extravagance can be grasped from the fact that nearly £18,000 were spent to lay down 1 mile of railway tracks in India, whereas some railways in the USA were built for as little as £2,000 per mile. While the railway companies were lining their pockets, the investors certainly didn't care. All the money came from the English capitalists, testified W.N. Massey, an ex-finance member of India in 1872, and so long as he was guaranteed 5% on the revenues of India, it was immaterial to him whether the funds he lent were thrown into the Hooghly or converted into brick and mortar. As railway construction picked up pace, so did the amount of money that had to be transferred to Britain as guaranteed returns. Between 1850 and 1900, India paid more than £50 million in guaranteed interest to railway companies, a considerable drain on government revenue which British officials in the Indian government constantly complained about. As a result, by the end of the 1860s, old contracts with railway companies had to be renegotiated with slightly less burdensome terms. Some companies were bought out, and the British government too proceeded with developing its own state railways. The guarantees, though, continued to be paid until the end of the century, even as repeated famines brought home the need for government revenue to be invested in irrigation rather than in railways. In fulfilling these financial obligations, the government of India obviously incurred quite a lot of debt, a substantial portion of it in London. Payments for servicing these sterling debts is another example of Indian taxes being simply given away as interest to London financiers. To conceive of these payments as returns on any kind of productive investment actually useful to the people of India who pay these taxes is kind of farcical. As we've seen, an overwhelming amount of the government's expenditure went into maintaining its military and administrative apparatus in India. But what's even worse is that India also had to pay for Britain's imperial wars and adventures, in addition to paying for the lavish expenses of the office of the Secretary of State for India in London, presumably in return for rendering to India the kind service of ruling it via remote control. Such hideously unjust military and administrative expenditure in London, dubbed home charges, along with interest payments on debt incurred to pay these home charges, took away on average more than 25% of Indian revenues every year in the last decade of the 19th century. The British financial system happily utilized this steady stream of payments from India to export capital to other parts of the industrializing world, an arrangement that was crucial in sustaining Britain's position as a leading economic superpower and the undisputed world hegemon at the close of the 19th century. First off, if you've made it this far in the video and not completely lost the will to live, thank you. I love you. You are truly special. And don't worry, all of this is going to be worth it, I think. Anyway, let's quickly recap what we've discussed so far before we proceed. In trying to figure out the ways in which India's agricultural classes were kept in a perpetual state of poverty, we examined the working of the British land revenue system. The system essentially functioned as a siphoning mechanism for transferring the wealth created by the actual cultivator to local parasites, the landlords, moneylenders, traders, etc., and the British government, and through the British government onward to British industrial and financial interests. We can refer to this mechanism as a direct appropriation of agricultural surplus, and owing to the importance of this appropriation to British geopolitical and business interests, there could be no relief granted to the peasant taxpayers, which would have allowed the accumulation of surplus in their hands and helped to improve their material conditions. Now, from a description of this direct mechanism, we can move on to talk about more indirect means of appropriation that operated alongside it, or rather on top of it, as this indirect mechanism relied crucially on the base level of impoverishment sustained by the revenue system. We can call this mechanism indirect because of two reasons. First, because it was not administered directly by the unholy trinity of Sarkar, Zamindar and Sahukar. Rather, it was administered through the market. That doesn't mean the unholy trinity had nothing to do with market-based appropriation. All three had a hand in determining the market terrain on which peasants and laborers operated. Landlords and moneylenders acted as middlemen, managing peasants' interaction with the market, while government, through its policies, also influenced the same, as we will soon see. The second reason why we can call this mechanism indirect, and now we can actually start talking about it, is the form in which the appropriation took place. In addition to the direct tax on the peasants' earnings, what we see starting from the 1860s is a long-term trend of rise in food grain prices, which acted as an indirect tax on consumption. To continue consuming the same quantity of food grains as before the price rise, cultivators would have to increase their food expenditure. However, if earnings are already at bare subsistence levels, just enough to keep them alive so they can continue paying rent, taxes and interest, and as we will see, if there is a further downward pressure on earnings, the possibility of increasing food expenditure is ruled out. The outcome then, on the one hand, is to decrease the quantity of food consumption of not just people in the agricultural sector, but also rural and urban artisans and wage laborers, basically everyone whose earnings do not increase in tandem with food prices. On the other hand, lower consumption of large parts of the population in the home market freed up a chunk of the local food grain supply to be diverted abroad as exports every year. Starting in the 1860s, export of food grains increasingly gained importance in India's export trade, and by 1880, food grains became the most valuable export commodity, surpassing cotton, opium, jute, indigo, tea, etc. As railway lines snaked out from major urban centers into the countryside, ever larger quantities of food grains were carried out, even in times of local scarcity. In 1867-68, around 650,000 tons of rice was exported. In 1895-96, the amount of rice exported stood at nearly 1.8 million tons, roughly 3 times the amount at the earlier date. The growth of wheat exports was even more staggering, starting as it did from a lower absolute level. In 1867-68, a little more than 15,000 tons of wheat was exported. Following the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 and the abolition of export duty on wheat in 1873, along with a fall in railway freight rates for carrying wheat, exports expanded considerably. In 1873-74, wheat exports touched 90,000 tons and reached their peak in 1891-92 when more than 1.5 million tons was shipped out, an increase of 100 times over 25 years. These substantial exports of food grains would not have been possible had local consumption not been reduced through inflation and direct appropriation. In a situation where there were no restrictions on exports, food grains essentially gravitated out of India towards foreign markets, such as the industrializing economies of Europe and North America, where consumers had a higher purchasing power than the Indian masses. In the absence of food grain imports, the diversion of domestic supply of food grains to exports obviously put a further upward pressure on food prices. But that was only one source of inflationary pressure. Another source of inflation which occupied the attention of British officials was the vast increase in India's money supply and a simultaneous depreciation of the silver rupee in relation to the gold-linked pound sterling. I'll try to explain why this happened briefly and how it relates to our main discussion about inflation. There was a worldwide glut in silver production starting in the 1870s, just as gold production stagnated. Around the same time, a bunch of countries junked their silver currencies and adopted the gold standard. So the global silver demand decreased at the same time that these countries' demonetized silver also appeared on the world market, worsening the silver glut and sending silver prices in relation to gold tumbling. In these conditions, countries like India with a silver currency could react in two ways. Either restrict the money supply in some way to regulate the gold-silver exchange rate, or they could do nothing and allow the currency to depreciate freely. For reasons that will become clear shortly, the British government went with the latter option. Unsurprisingly, a sea of silver poured into India. The amount of rupees in circulation increased by 48% between 1876 and 1891. In 1877, India absorbed 84% of the world's silver production. Between 1872-73 and 1894-95, the rupee lost 42% of its value compared to sterling. And finally, coming back to our main discussion about inflation, prices showed a consistent increase. Between 1861-65 and 1906-1910, the general price level in the country increased by about 70%. This in contrast to the first half of the 19th century when prices had remained largely stable. Retail prices of the major food grains were naturally more volatile due to seasonal fluctuations, but nevertheless showed a consistent upward trend in all important grain-producing provinces in the same period. Even as the working masses of India failed to keep up their intake of food in the face of rising prices, the accompanying silver depreciation ensured that there would be no let-up in the downward pressure on the earnings of the peasantry. With every fall in the value of silver with respect to gold, the government's foreign liabilities, the home charges, subsidies to railway companies, and debt servicing would increase even if these liabilities remained constant, as these had to be paid in gold. As we know, the liabilities did not remain constant and in fact grew, and the rupee continued to fall, putting considerable strain on the government's ability to pay and prompting the Indian government in 1878 and 1886 to request the Secretary of State in London to take steps to stabilize the value of the rupee vis-a-vis the sterling. No such steps were forthcoming at the time, and it wasn't until 1893 that the Indian government was allowed to restrict the money supply in the country in order to control the rupee's fall. Consequently, for nearly 2 decades before 1893, the burden of meeting the government's vastly enhanced gold liabilities on account of depreciation was also put on Indian revenues. There could be no relaxation in the pursuit of squeezing the most out of the Indian population. In certain parts of the country where the rate of taxation on land was not fixed and was open to revisions, land tax was increased. For example, in some regions of the central provinces, tax reassessment in 1887 saw rates increase by 50%, and in certain districts of Bombay Presidency, the burden of taxation increased between 32 to 56% in 1875. It was argued that an increase in prices entitled the government to greater revenue, as the earnings of the peasants must have also increased. But this line of reasoning falls prey to the old mistaken idea of a free peasantry, selling its produce in the open market at the highest price. As we've already talked about, such an advantageous position was reserved for a small section of socially well-placed landholders. Small and marginal peasants, however, were not really free to dispose of their produce at the market price because their interaction with the market was mediated through the local parasitical classes, the landlords, moneylenders, and grain traders. And it was quite common in most parts of the country for one person to perform all three roles. The ultimate parasite. It was this class of people who had wedged themselves between the peasantry and the market thanks to the revenue system that the benefits of the booming export trade and rising prices went to. Through the provision of loans and advances to a dependent peasantry, the parasitical classes gained control of their produce at a cost well below the prevailing market price. The operations of a highly exclusive guild of landlords, traders, and moneylenders from Mathura were described as follows in a report from the 1870s. The guild can compel the producer, who lives solely by the advances they give him, to bring his produce to their shops and prevent him getting the full market value for his goods. The cultivator is therefore not only crippled by the heavy interest he has to pay, but also by the low price he is compelled to take for his produce. The same outcome was accomplished in the Bombay Deccan through a different mechanism. As Mike Davis writes, the annual process of revenue collection began with the impounding of grain in village stockyards. In order to eat from their own harvest, the ryots had to immediately borrow money to pay off the taxes. Typically, the moneylenders bought the crop at half of the current market value but lent money at a usurious 38% interest. Further, by making the availability of loans and advances subject to the cultivation of specific crops, the parasitical class also helped to induce a shift in the cropping pattern of the country. For cash-poor peasants who had to pay their tax installments in cash lest they be evicted from their holdings, the advances were irresistible to tide over their tax worries, even if it meant that they had to switch from growing millets and other inferior food grains meant for their own consumption to the cultivation of commercially important crops which the parasitical class wanted to sell in urban and international markets like cotton, indigo, jute, opium, groundnut, sugarcane, etc. And of course the most exportable food grain, wheat. Crucially, this substitution of cash crops in place of food crops added another inflationary pressure to food prices by decreasing domestic supply at the same time that demand was growing due to the increase, however slow, of the population. This was especially true of pulses and millets like ragi, jowar, bajra, etc., which were the staple grains consumed by the poorer population in unirrigated dry areas. Because these were not meant for export and were commercially less lucrative for the parasitical class to sell, they were either replaced or relegated to poorer soils, while the best lands were reserved for cash crops. At the same time as food supply was struggling to keep up with population growth, there was a demand side pressure as well from the increased food grain consumption of the parasitical class, who were awash in the silver pouring into the country due to the export trade they controlled. The result wasn't just a steady increase in the prices of millets, but also, as the revenue report from Hardoi district of present-day UP described, the perverse phenomenon of jowar and bajra being sold to the poor by the grain dealers at prices actually exceeding the rates at which the wealthy purchase wheat. The other great beneficiaries of India's export trade, apart from the parasitical class, were their foreign clients who imported India's agricultural produce into their countries. Thanks to the silver depreciation, the cost of India's agricultural commodities fell in gold terms, and importers outside India were only too eager to tap into a source of cheap raw materials for industry and food grains. Britain, India's largest trading partner and the destination of most of India's exports, hugely benefited from this. Wheat from India's Narmada Valley in present-day Madhya Pradesh, writes Mike Davis, arrived in English grain exchanges just in time to buffer the decline of Russian exports. It stabilized the price of flour in the season when other imported grains were scarce and provided a reserve for lucrative re-export during grain shortages on the continent. The British government, in choosing not to control India's money supply and letting the rupee depreciate, was basically doing private British capital a great favor. By deliberately cheapening Indian food and cash crops in gold terms, it ensured that a reserve of food and raw materials for industry would always be available at a low price to cover for any possible shortfall from its main sources, which would otherwise trigger a hike in prices. British industrialists therefore were able to keep a lid on the wages of their employees as the price of the main wage good, that is food, was kept under control, as were the costs of the industrial inputs. In other words, India's cheap agricultural produce was being used by British capital to pad its profit margins by lowering its overall costs. In return for providing profits to British capital, India's agricultural classes received only the uncertainty, volatility, and cruelty of the global market. In the early 1890s, after 2 decades of growing wheat exports from the Narmada Valley, British buyers switched to other sources, cheap wheat from Argentina and the canal colonies of Punjab. The impact on the small peasantry of the region, which had spent the last 20 years mining their soil to export wheat and racked up huge amounts of debt in the process, was catastrophic. Exports rapidly dwindled and reached an insignificant level by 1896. And then came a series of droughts and famines, one of the deadliest ever, that lasted till the end of the century and wiped off millions. The case of the Narmada Valley was not unique. A similar fate awaited the cultivators of virtually all Indian cash crops. The celebrated and short-lived cotton boom of the 1860s, just to give one more example, was followed by decades of low cotton prices, as the price of Indian cotton was determined by the availability of supplies from the American South, the favored source of cotton of the British textile industry. Much as in the case of wheat farmers in the Narmada Valley, Indian cotton farmers became a reserve workforce for the great textile mills of Manchester, to be used only when the need arose to stabilize the price of raw cotton. For British industry, Indian cotton and the people who grew it were, in the words of one author, a sort of permanent 12th man, always ready in the pavilion but only occasionally brought onto the field of play. The long-term effects of this arrangement on the health and food security of the peasantry were quite disastrous. The Deccan district of Berar, which in 1867 was supplying as much cotton to Britain as all of Egypt, saw the average life expectancy of its residents fall to around 15 years in the 1890s and then slip further to under 10 years in 1900, a famine year. While around 143,000 of its residents died of starvation due to the famine, Berar exported tens of thousands of bales of cotton, and yes, it gets worse, more than 20,000 tons of its food grains. Hurled into the swirling vortex of international trade with its boom and bust cycles and unchecked speculative activity, squeezed to within an inch of their lives by a relentlessly extractive revenue system, preyed upon by local parasites who came to control their entire lives. This was the condition a large number of peasants and agricultural labourers found themselves in the years following Queen Victoria's famous proclamation of 1858. Year by year, the state market parasite nexus forced down their food consumption through the deliberate imposition of multiple inflationary pressures. In the process, enormous amounts of food grain and cash crops were freed up for export to cater to the needs of Britain and other industrializing countries. In this way, the agricultural classes were kept on the edge throughout these years, teetering on the brink of starvation. If the rains failed catastrophically, hoarding and speculation would ensue, pushing prices to famine levels, as whatever local reserves the village community could have accumulated in the good years were either shipped abroad or were locked up in the stores of the parasites. As Whitcomb writes about present-day Uttar Pradesh, during the scarcity of 1877, large stocks accumulated from previous good seasons were in the hands of zamindars and dealers. Throughout the summer, as the deterioration in Kharif conditions became more and more apparent, a brisk exportation business persisted nevertheless. But the Kharif failure induced creditors to turn away their cultivator clients from fear that their diminishing stocks might not get replenished in that season. It was in their interest to withhold loans and thus to drive prices still higher. This was, as I said earlier, the final nudge. God knows how many died from hunger. Those that starvation didn't take were left greatly weakened, and they were swept away in millions by waves of epidemics: malaria, cholera, tuberculosis, and even the bubonic plague. In the period between the two royal proclamations by mother and son, that is between 1860 and 1908, famine or extreme scarcity conditions prevailed in 20 out of a total of 49 years in some part of the country or other. Although the reduction of mass consumption continued right up to the end of the colonial period, no further famines visited the country for the next 3.5 decades after 1908. One reason for that was that India became a net importer of food grains. The illusion of a famine-free India was, however, brutally shattered by the Bengal famine of 1943, when probably the most intense and rapid forced reduction of mass consumption, similar to what we've been talking about, was engineered to fund the war effort against Imperial Japan, killing more than 3 million people. Believe it or not, this is just the bare bones of the agricultural situation in India in the mid to late colonial period. There was so much more going on that I've not been able to talk about, like how the railways, while taking out agricultural produce, brought in cheap British textile products and undermined the livelihoods of rural weavers who were often reduced to the status of landless agricultural labourers, swelling the ranks of people dependent on the land for employment. Or how the British justice system, in the name of enforcing contracts and private property rights, facilitated the evictions of indebted peasants and enforced the transfer of land to the parasitical classes. Or how the deep devotion of British administrators to free trade orthodoxy undermined famine relief measures and led to millions of preventable deaths. Or how the expansion of cultivation to increase land revenue and exports led to the enclosure of local forests and common grazing lands, which meant that resources that were previously available for free to the rural population, such as forest produce, firewood, fodder, grass, etc., had to be purchased from the market. further increasing their cost of living. Or how the expansion of cultivation and railway construction necessitated rampant deforestation that increased soil erosion and reduced the capacity of the soil to hold moisture, increasing vulnerability to droughts. Or how the commercialization of Indian forests for timber threatened India's forest-dwelling communities, who were then deemed to be criminal tribes. Or how the inaccessibility of firewood forced the use of cow dung as a fuel, reducing its usage as a fertilizer and leading to soil mining and exhaustion. Or how the laying of railway tracks, construction of railway bridges, and digging of massive canal networks interfered with natural drainage lines, causing waterlogging and turning certain areas into malarial swamps. Or how canals in some regions contributed to increasing soil salinity, rendering the land uncultivable. Or how all this ecological destabilization and social reconfiguration combined to bring about an incalculable loss of diversity, both biological and social, and so many more important things that I don't even know about. All that we have talked about, however, is enough to reach some broad conclusions about colonial India's agriculture, which will be useful to bear in mind as we proceed towards examining independent India's agricultural trajectory. First, it should be clear that integration and participation in international markets need not by itself be a good thing for the vast majority of producers. Far from being a benign force bringing together two entities on a level playing field, international markets can and do, in fact, conceal vast pre-existing disparities of social and economic power between two entities by giving the exploitation of one by the other an impersonal, economically rational character. There are well-respected people out there who assert that the problems with Indian agriculture today in the present can be solved by just getting rid of all barriers to international trade and letting markets reign supreme. In light of all we've discussed so far, going down that road even further than we already have would be a grave refusal to learn anything from our own past. Second, reiterating something I mentioned in the introduction. What we saw in the colonial period is that for a certain section of the country at least, the one in possession of land, capital and social power, integration into the international market generally worked out quite well. If you were one of the parasites, you were probably swimming in a pool of silver like Uncle Scrooge from DuckTales by aiding in the exploitation of your own country's land and people. This is relevant in the context of current debates on agricultural policies because a small group of really rich people stand to make even more money if Indian agriculture is completely assimilated into international markets to the same degree as it was in the colonial period. The potential profits of domestic corporate capital should not, however, lead us to uncritically assume that those profits will translate into better incomes for the vast majority of marginal cultivators in this country. Just like it would be foolish to assume in the colonial period that the peasantry was thriving because a few people at the top were getting crazy rich. And finally, a major determining factor in who benefits from integration with international markets is domestic policy, for obvious reasons. The reason why integration into international markets worked out so poorly for the small peasantry in the colonial period was because domestic policy was not framed with their welfare in mind. It was designed for the welfare of British industry and finance. Hence, it was the latter who benefited and the former who suffered. That was good old-fashioned imperialism we had. There was a certain kind of transparency in the total capture of domestic policy by the colonial government, a directness to the way integration with international markets was used to alter the structure of the Indian economy to provide markets and cheap resources for British capital. As we move into the period of decolonization and beyond, we will see that despite having lost direct political control over the countries, foreign capital and the nation states that represented them developed ways of influencing the domestic policies of newly liberated countries of the global south that did not require direct political control but were nevertheless capable of achieving the outcomes they wanted. Rather than running a country via remote control from the imperial center, it was possible to pressurize a sovereign nation to change its domestic policies by a combination of lobbying the government with the help of think tanks, international aid agencies, philanthropic organizations, etc., and by threatening to withhold access to some resource these countries desperately needed, whether that be food or foreign capital. As we'll see in part 3, by the 1980s, a perfect instrument of this new, indirect, more opaque kind of imperialism had been invented and given the horribly banal yet sinister name of structural adjustment.